Hello and welcome to an episode of ReConnect, where we give you the TLDR version of one of our great Connect events. Joining me here today is Brian Vecchi. I'm Kilian Angler. Didn't forget to introduce myself that time. We're going to talk about automation and automatic remediation. So Brian, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Kilian. Good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about automatic remediation, what the steps are involved, and we're going to cover some of the hottest questions that we had from our Connect event. So Brian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so the Connect that we did, it was a great one. It was all focused on automatic remediation. And I'm going to skip a lot. I'm going to skip almost all of it. What we're talking about is cleaning up global access. So the idea is, if you've got data that's open to everybody in the company, anybody who opens a laptop and authenticates to a domain controller has got access to this data. We do a risk assessment. It's usually about 20% of the data that we see. It's a big security problem. It's a big compliance problem. It's a big data protection problem. And solving it is a bit of a nightmare. So this whole Connect event went into a lot of detail about exactly how we do it. I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes here. So let's assume that this is a problem that you want to solve. Let's assume that you've got a big file server or lots of file servers with hundreds of thousands of folders, maybe millions of folders that are open to everybody. How do you actually do it? How do you use Varonis to do it? So I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of how this works and what it would actually what it would look like. And then I think we're going to spend all of our time going through all the questions that came up because there were tons of them. If you'd like to see more detail, right, go back and watch you can go back and go to our website and watch the recording of the full Connect event. But today we're just going to dive into everything people wanted to know about how this works, right?
Sounds good.
Okay. So let's assume that you understand this is a problem. This is assume that you want to fix this problem, that you want to remediate open access to either sensitive data or just data overall. And just to be really specific, we're talking about file system data, CIFS, SMB, stuff that's on Windows file shares. Okay. To make this make sense, let's think about what you would do if you had to fix a single folder. I was in IT for years before it, so were most people that are at Varonis. I know you were too, Kilian. And a lot of us have gone through this before. So first of all, you have to find the folder that you want to fix, right? This is harder than you think. There's about 80-something thousand folders on average in a single terabyte of data. We just did a risk assessment with a customer that I was on the phone with before we started here, and they had 15 petabytes on a single isolon. So, we can multiply this, but there's hundreds of millions of folders. So first of all, you got to find them, and you need to find the ones that are uniquely permissioned, right? Because you don't want to change the permission of every single folder. You want to change the permissions of the ones where inheritance is broken, and basically the folders are protected in Windows. So first of all, you got to find them. Second thing you need to do is figure out who actually needs access to this data. So if I'm going to remove a folder, let's say the everyone group or domain users or authenticated users has access, and I'm going to fix that, I need to replace it with something. I need to replace it with a new security group, and I need to know who to put in that group, right? Who actually needs access to this, which humans, which service accounts. And this is an exercise. This is calling people up. This is sending emails that never get responded to. This is what takes forever, trying to figure this out.
Right.
And you can't be wrong, because if you're wrong and you remove everyone from having access, stuff's going to break. Applications are going to break. People are going to call up screaming. So once you figure that out, you put them in a dedicated security group. This is moving to a much more mature security model where you have a single purpose or resource-based group for the data. Then add the new group to the access control list of the folder. You want the global group and the new group to exist at the same time, because when you make this change, you don't want to have people to log out and log back in, which will refresh their Kerberos tokens. Windows, because if you don't wait and you just pull off the global group, the Kerberos tokens of all the currently logged in users will assume that will not know that user is in the newly created group and could deny access to this data. So you wait. Usually it's 3 days. That's the default configuration. Everybody's Kerberos tokens will refresh. Then you can remove the global access group. You've fixed the problem. Doing this for a single folder, if you don't have Varonis, can take hours. I've talked to companies where it takes weeks. If you do have us and you're using Data Advantage to run through this simulation where you go back in time based on past behavior, you can do this in a couple of minutes. With the automation engine, you can completely automate this entire process, and you can go through an entire server in a matter of hours or days we've done entire environments, hundreds of terabytes of data in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is if you can automate the entire thing and do it safely, users will have no idea that it's happening, and you can save yourself years of work, sometimes decades. I mean, there's a healthcare company here in New York. It's 6.2 million folders, right? So start doing the math. If you're if it's even a couple of hours per folder, you're talking about decades worth of work,
right.
And that's why nobody does it, right? That's why we never actually do this. You might do this for one folder, and it's a really kind of resource-intensive exercise, but you're never going to do it at scale, and new data is going to get created over time. So you're going to have to keep doing this over and over. There's one of the big banks in here in New York, also different. They weren't a customer of ours. They actually spun up a team, 40 people, that they were going to try to fix these folders. And this team of 40 people would come in on the weekends and go through these remediation exercises. And then on Monday, they would kind of pray that they didn't break anything. They budgeted, I think, 18 months for the project. After 4 years, they had gotten through a couple of percent, of like 2 to 3% of their total data. And they hadn't even touched any of the data that had been created since they started.
Right.
And this is after 4 years. So you end up with failed projects. We can do it totally automatically. Here's how it works. So remember that Varonis has a map of every single folder. We also have a record of every single data touched by every human and machine user on every single file in every single folder. So you can create a policy. And a lot of what the webinar, the Connect event was about, okay, how do you actually create these policies? How do you choose which folders to remediate? How do you actually structure this to hit change management windows? Shai Azule from our product team, who's been directly involved in a lot of these large scale remediations, was there talking through a lot of the details. The idea, though, is I'm going to create a policy. In this case, I'm going to do it on a folder tree. The policy is going to run a simulation based on past activities, and it's going to do two things. It's going to show you the groups that it's going to create. In this case, we're going to create a read group and a modify group based on the type of activity that people are exhibiting on that folder. Then it's going to go back in time. You can go back in time a month, 4 months, a year. We typically recommend at least 4 months, so that you've got a rolling quarter. And then what you see here is here's all the people that are going to get added to the new groups. Then you add those groups and pull off the global access groups 3 days later. Then you go back to your risk indicators. How much data do I have? How many folders are open to everybody, especially with sensitive data? And you see something that looks like this. What the Connect event did is walk through that in a lot more detail. And we showed you the rule creation, some of the things that you want to be cognizant of, like don't spend a lot of time and energy trying to clean up stale data. How do you prioritize it?
Right.
And we told a lot of stories about the kinds of projects that we've been involved in and how this really under the hood works.
Yeah.
So there's the overview. It sounds like people had a ton of questions about, because this is one of these things that is unique to Varonis. This is one of these things you can't do with any other product or technology.
Right.
You need to have so many different components. You need to map every single folder. You need to monitor every single access event. Those two things are incredibly difficult to do. You need to be able to affect change to both the file system and to Active Directory. You need to simulate based on past activities. We have a commit engine, so when you actually make the changes, they're done safely and you can always roll them back. There's so many unique components to us that we put together in order to build this that it sounded like the audience had a lot of questions about it, because this isn't something where it's like, why don't I do it in this other way? Because there's really no other way to do it.
No, I love this, and I love that you showed this graph. I love showing this to customers too. It always lights up their eyes. You love when you see that steep drop off. Now I love it in this graph. Now if this was my bank account, different story. But in the situation here, this is what everybody wants to see. So
this is the evidence that you've actually done it. It's
right.
We could say, if you look at talking to a CISO, it's like not only are we measuring the risk, but we're doing something about it, and it didn't take us years to do. And what it's really funny. We had a customer that ran this, and then their IT or the security team got distracted, and you can see sometimes the graph will start creeping slowly back up. You can absolutely predict basically your data growth rate is going to be your global access growth rate. So you get a lot of long-term success when you just kind of run this on a regular basis and just keep those numbers down at zero.
That's awesome. So let's take this opportunity to switch back over here, and let's jump into the questions. We have a ton of them from the event. So I've broken these up that came into a couple different categories, some general ones, some technical ones, some others. So we'll jump in and let's just go from there. So one of the topics that comes up a lot is zero trust and some of these models for protecting data.
Mhm.
So one of the big ones that came up, I think maybe even a couple times, was how does Varonis and automation engine help support a zero trust model?
What an exceptionally good question. Because when you think about zero trust, the idea is you don't want to grant users, you don't want to grant people or
Mhm.
accounts, or basically, you just don't want to grant anybody access to things that they don't need to have access to. So the idea
Mhm.
of zero trust is you lock out networks, devices, services, and data
Mhm.
from people who don't have ideally a just-in-time need, but any
Right.
need to access that. This notion of open access or global access is a direct violation of zero trust.
Sure.
If you have a folder that has useful data in it and it's open to all authenticated users,
Mhm.
that means that all somebody needs to do is authenticate, prove who they
Mhm.
are, who they say they are, and then they have access to that data. You're not exhibiting zero trust at all. The idea of
Mhm.
zero trust is they have to have an organizational need, or really a business need, or
Mhm.
some sort of justifiable reason to have access to that data. So what the automation engine is doing is it is applying a preventive control. It's applying a
Mhm.
restrictive control about who has access to that data based on whether they're actually using it or not. So it's an excellent first step to
Yeah.
locking down data and implementing zero trust. The long-term goal is, once you've run this
Mhm.
to lock down data from being open to everybody, is then to put in an additional accountability control where you understand who the data owner is and they're
Mhm.
reviewing on a regular basis access to data. Just-in-time access to data is certainly possible, and you can also
Mhm.
implement that. But at the very least, what the automation engine is doing is saying, okay, my data is now only available to those who have a defensible need for it,
Mhm.
rather than anybody in the company. And usually global access like this isn't set up by design.
Right.
It's a configuration mistake. It's because
Mhm.
data was moved over from a legacy environment, or somebody made a mistake when they set up the permissions of new folders, or um, or authenticated users is buried inside a group that
Right.
has access. We see that too. So this is usually a mistake that you are correcting.
Mhm.
That is something that you need to do in order to implement zero trust. And the automation engine is the only way to do this on
Mhm.
data, this kind of data anyway.
Yep. So that brings me to another question we have in the list that a lot of people asked, and I think I know what your answer is. I know what your answer is.
Mhm.
Is there ever a scenario where the everyone group should be ever given full access?
Full access, I can't imagine one. There's probably never a certain area that anybody besides a domain administrator or
Mhm.
some sort of administrator should have full access to anything, because full access implies that you have the ability to change permissions.
Right.
So and like literally in the NTFS mask, there was an F for full, and full
Yeah.
gives you the ability to change permissions, which is a massive security risk, because then an attacker that got access to that account could lock out your administrators, which could be a
Right.
real problem. Now, is there a scenario where everyone should have any level of access? I've certainly seen organizations that have had read level access to lots of
Mhm.
places. A couple ways to think about this. Some IT organizations allow open access, or everyone, or authenticated users or domain users, to have traverse level permissions on
Mhm.
folders so that they can see the contents of folders. Some don't. We generally recommend not, because then you can see file names and folder names, which can be a security risk on its own.
Mhm.
But there's also, you might have, say, an HR folder that has
Right.
blank forms, for instance. Let's
Mhm.
allow everyone to read that data so they can
Yep.
pull it out. I've also seen organizations that'll have everyone having modify access to folders as kind of company drop boxes, or
Right.
places like communal places where you can put data. And that the idea is to ease the friction of collaboration, to make it
Mhm.
easy for people to work together. That's generally a disaster. You end up with sensitive data that shouldn't be in there, and
Yeah.
now everybody has access to it. We really don't recommend you have that, but I've certainly seen it before,
Mhm.
and I've certainly seen some CISOs try to justify it as
Sure.
this is a business need. That kind of thing tends to be going away, though. There's
Mhm.
much better ways to enable that kind of collaboration than just having an open bucket that anybody can dump something in.
Yep. You pre-answered my follow-up question to that, so that's it's like we're on the same page with this. Um,
Almost, yeah.
I have another question that comes up all the time from a lot of people, and you already sort of answered it, but I'm gonna ask it again just to make sure. What's the difference between authenticated users and everyone when applied to the ACLs?
That's a good one. They're both abstract objects
Sure.
in a Windows world. The everyone's a legacy object. Somebody is going to correct me if I'm wrong. I think it went away after Windows 2000 Server 2008. The idea was, in early versions of Windows, you'd have this abstract object that would allow anything that could connect to the network to
Hmm.
access data, and that was also the kind of the default level of access for new
Hmm.
shares that were created. Later versions of Windows added this object, or this object called authenticated users,
Hmm.
which it's different from everyone in that with everyone, all you need to do is be on the network.
Right.
You don't need to authenticate at all. It could be guest. You don't have to provide a valid credential to a domain controller. Authenticated users assumes that at least the user is authenticating to a domain controller and is a user or computer object that should, so it is a tighter level of control, but functionally not much, since all of your user accounts and all of your computer accounts and all of your service accounts are going to be able to authenticate. It's a little bit better control. And honestly, I've been in meetings where somebody said, no, we got rid of this global access problem. We got rid of everyone. What did you do? We replaced it with authenticated users. It's like, good job. I mean, so now, you've made a very, very basic change. So now the number of people that can access this data went from functionally whatever it is, the number of employees plus 10, or maybe all these guest users, to just the number of employees. It's still a problem. The authenticated users is, again, a very useful object, but make sure you realize it's literally all authenticated users.
Yeah. This one's a little bit more of a think piece, a head scratcher. So we'll throw it out and we'll see what you think. So we had somebody ask, and this is not 100% verbatim, but it's close. So cleaning up is great, but doesn't fix how you got there in the first place. The bad situation exists because of bad business processes. How does Varonis prevent the bad situation from recreating itself over time?
As you said, this is a really great thought exercise, and it's also a really great discussion point. There is no single thing that you should be doing to prevent this thing from happening, because there's lots of ways that it can happen. It can happen by mistake. It can be happening because of a broken process where it is by design, by a design that needs to be corrected. One of the benefits of having Varonis in place, though, is that we're looking at all the activity, including all the permission changes and the folder creations and the permission creations, and then the actual data activity there. So we can help you figure out exactly who or what is setting these things up.
Sure.
And who or what do you need to go talk to figure out the business process that needs to be changed. Also, once we're installed, we can start, and we have threat models for this and reports for this out of the box to start alerting you when this stuff actually happens.
Right.
So that it doesn't happen and then you don't know about it. So you don't go and you don't leave it uncorrected.
Sure.
So the premise of the question is absolutely right. This is a misconfiguration that is usually because of some sort of broken process that is either happening or happened in the past, or is an artifact of something like a migration where somebody didn't realize that this was going to be the end result. Varonis can help you with all of that. We can help you fix the problem, help you figure out why it's happening, because we're monitoring all of the activity, and we can alert you if it ever happens again. And we can continue to make sure that you're cleaning it up when it does.
That's awesome. Thank you. That was a good one.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I'm gonna toss you a real softball one this time. We're getting into a little bit more of the technical questions. So, does Varonis look at share permissions or NTFS permissions, or both?
The answer is both.
Cool.
So, and actually, it was the early versions of Varonis only looked at NTFS. We added share permissions at sometime like right after I joined. So it's been like 10 years now. And I remember it was like in 5.6 or something. We added the ability to scan share permissions. And for those of you who don't know, Windows has a concept. So there are folders have NTFS permissions, which is full, modify, read, write, execute list. And then there's also this concept of you can create a share, and share is just read group full or read write full. So it's a simpler permissions mask. And you can also have shares nested within shares. So there are ways, it gets really complicated. Wait, what can somebody actually do? Right. The idea is the least permissive of the combination of share and NTFS permissions is what somebody actually has access to. And the best practice, because shares still exist, it's more of a legacy way of sharing data. They still exist because you can't really take them away. But the idea is what Microsoft says, and what we recommend too, is when you're setting up shares, you set the share permissions to be everyone full control, and then you lock things down at the NTFS level. To answer the question directly, Varonis is looking at both, and we will report on and show you in the interface the effective permissions from both. So just because there's a share permission that's everyone full control doesn't mean you have this massive risk problem if the NTFS permissions are locked down appropriately, which is how you're supposed to manage it.
No, that's great. I think that really helps a lot of people. Another big one that came up a couple times is during the global group remediation with Varonis, does the automation engine create the security groups for you, or do they have to set this up beforehand before they start executing it?
It's a good question. The automation engine creates them for you. Okay. And you have control over what OU those groups go into and the naming convention. So you can make sure that they're created according to your policy, and you can add other metadata to them as well. So you have a lot of granular control over how those are created. You can also, before you run the automation engine, before you do the real run, you could do a simulation and it'll show you exactly what's going to get created and where it's going to get put. But yeah, you have control over that.
Yeah, that's awesome. This one comes up a number of times from newer customers or people who are looking at Varonis or to add the module. Oftentimes they ask, how long should I let Varonis collect auditing information in order for it to suggest who to add to the new groups during the automation engine run?
My recommendation is at least 3 months, probably 4 months. 3 months gives you a quarter. Depending on when you start, 4 months gives you the rolling quarter. And the reason for that is a lot of data may only be accessed at the end or at the beginning of a quarter. So you want to be running kind of over that. You don't want to wait. You don't want to just do it after a day, right? Because there's a lot of data that won't be accessed within that first day. So it's from the moment you started auditing, which for the most part is when you deploy Varonis. And by the way, even if you don't have the automation engine now, but you have Varonis deployed, you might have had it deployed for a couple of years. We use all the past audit data. So if you've got Varonis deployed, you're good. But on a new server, or if you're a new Varonis customer, about 4 months is a good rule of thumb, which gives you plenty of time, by the way, because when you deploy, you're not just letting Varonis sit there and collect audit information. We're also alerting on that behavior. It doesn't take nearly that long for all of our threat models to bake in to understand what's normal and not. So you're going to start getting alerted when people access data strangely, or if they access sensitive data inappropriately, or it looks like you're under attack. You can also make sure all of the dashboards and reporting are properly configured. There's going to be a lot of things that you can do in the meantime, and so that you're using the platform to deploy and operationalize. And then when you're ready, 4 months in, all right, let's run the automation engine to clean things up. Some customers, especially ones that have been customers for a while, that have years of audit data, will go back in time a year, because why not? It's the further back you go, the more likely you are to catch everybody who could potentially need access. On the other hand, there's an argument to be made that go back, a rolling quarter, go back 4 months, and anybody who hasn't accessed the data in 4 months, that's fine. If they need access, they can ask for it again, rather than just letting anybody who's ever touched this data have perpetual access forever, right? So 4 months is a really good rule of thumb. Between 4 months and a year is what most customers go with.
Awesome. So the next one up that comes up fairly often is, can automation engine rules be configured to apply restrictive permissions to locations identified by the data classification engine? Yeah,
and we go into that in the Connect event when we talk about scoping and prioritizing. So the automation engine rules themselves, basically what you're doing is you're creating a policy for a folder tree that you want to remediate, and where you start creating those rules can and often is informed by, all right, I don't want to do this on stale data. The stuff that's not being used, why bother cleaning this up? Let's just lock it down. And then for all the other data, let's start with the most sensitive stuff, the most active stuff. And so the answer is yes. The engine rules themselves won't take the classification into account, but where and how you scope them to run can be informed, and often is. And we have reports specifically to help you understand where you should be prioritizing. And we go into some of that detail in the broader Connect events. If you'd like to see that, you guys certainly go watch that recording.
This one, I'm going to go a little bit off topic, but you brought up a really good point. And I've seen this in some of the other ones. Would it make sense, or is there a benefit to doing any type of cleanup or remediation or moving of stale data before running the automation engine?
Maybe not running before. If you're going to run the automation engine, just run it. But you certainly could. Generally, with the stale data, what we're recommending is just don't worry about running the automation engine on it, because if it's stale, you're going to create groups that are empty, right? Because nobody's actually using it. So don't bother. Just lock it down or archive it or delete it. And so the deleting is sometimes that especially gives storage and infrastructure people, I don't want to delete anything. Fine, but lock it down to domain admins, right? Just don't leave it open so it's not at risk anymore. But there's no automation engine to run on it for a permissions cleanup, because the automation engine depends on activity, and if it's stale, there's no activity.
That's a great one. I think a lot of people find that useful and interesting. Another follow-up around some of the remediation. How does Varonis decide if someone should have access during a remediation?
So should is an interesting word here. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a legitimate business need to have access to data. There is an argument here that just because someone has been accessing something doesn't mean that they're supposed to have access to it, which is why the automation engine is step one.
Yep.
You don't want to leave it open to everybody just because somebody that doesn't need access to it is still accessing it. You want to lock it down to just people who are accessing it. The next step, though, is figure out, all right, who does this belong to, and have them do a review. We have a whole nother Connect event about how we can help you do that. What you're really getting to is the steps of our operational journey. Who should have access is an organizational decision that 99.9% of the time cannot and should not be made by IT security or compliance. Sure. It should be made by the people who understand what this data is and why and how it's being used by that organization. It's an organizational asset. Should is that kind of decision. Just because Brian has been accessing data doesn't mean he should have access to data. The people whose data that belongs to know whether Brian should have access to it. And we can help you do that too. But that's step one is clean up global access, because until you do that, you can't identify an owner and have them review access and then really decide that should.
That's great. I think that'll help a lot of people kind of understanding the process. The last question.
So we have so many of these Connect events. This is it's not just one thing you need to do. There's a series of steps that you go through.
Well, we can plug the rest of them because we're going to have some other ones coming out anyway. So there we go. So the last question I have here, and this is just this comes up often. I think this is you'll understand in a second, kind of a warm and fuzzy question. But should something go wrong, is there a way to roll back any of the changes that they've made?
Really, really, really good question. It shows something that's been thinking ahead or has gone through these kind of projects before. So one of the primary benefits of using Varonis to do this in the automation engine is that every change that we make, whether it's a data owner doing an entitlement review or a change that you make in Data Advantage or the automation engine making these big, global access remediation changes, every change goes through what we call our commit engine, which means that the changes are made from distributed servers, the collector servers that are actually gathering data and sitting physically close to the servers that we're fixing and monitoring. That means the changes are able to actually able to take place without breaking. That one of the things that the commit engine does is it keeps track of all the changes in the order that they happen in. So if you ever need to undo them or roll them back, you can do it in reverse order, and you can do that. You can roll back at any time. It's a huge benefit of using us to make these changes. And that commit engine is also exposed by API. So there's other ways to use it beyond just the automation engine.
Awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining. This was great. This was informative. I think I learned some stuff. I think our audience probably is going to learn a little bit about this. So,
I don't believe you actually learned anything because you've taught me half of this stuff too, but I hope that this has been useful for everybody. And if you go watch the full Connect, you can see this in a lot more detail, but I think you got certainly got the Cliff's notes and the highlights here, and I'm glad we could answer some of these questions for people.
Absolutely. And to help out, I'll put a link in the description below. I'll use my YouTube vernacular here down below. We'll put a link in.
Smash that like button.
That's a good suggestion. If folks out there watching find this useful, informative, please feel free to leave a comment and let us know. That's really nice when you do. Or consider subscribing. We have some more coming up, and we have some other content that we've been working on that you might also enjoy. So with that, thank you again. Thank you, Brian, for joining. Take care, and we'll see you on the next episode of ReConnect.